there. Our panel tonight includes Mel White. Mel was one of the funeral directors of the Mason White Funeral Home. I'm sure many of you know him. Brad Essig, who is also not just a longtime Washingtonian, a Washingtonian forever. And by the way, to be on this panel, you don't have to have been born in Washington. To be in the Historical Society, you do not have to have been born in Washington. So please join us, even if you're not born in Washington. Joan Knott, who I believe was Joan Cummings, and Joanne Summer. And Dr. Tom Gross had a previous commitment, so he couldn't join us tonight. But we're going to listen to stories that these four panel members have, and they will be using the microphone, so I'm going to pass it on to Mel. And if you'd like to stand, you might be able to be heard better.
I'd like to thank the...
You might want to, does he need to hold it? Okay.
I'd like to thank the Society for inviting me tonight. And I'd like to talk about what Washington was like back in the 30s when we moved here. And my family came from Minot about 1900. My father was born in Minot and his brother. And he attended the schools here in Washington. And my mother came from the 10 Mile Creek area. Somebody remember the 10 Mile Creek? It's right at the bottom of the Germantown Hill. And they were married here in Washington. And then he worked at Pfeiffer's department store. And then he also helped I.W. Miller, the undertaker, who was on the north side of the square. And they moved to Peoria, and he decided he'd like to be an undertaker, so he had to serve a 2-year apprenticeship in those days and then go to school and receive his license. And he worked for several firms, 2 of them in Peoria before we come to Washington in 1935. And the Denhart home was available at that time, and we opened a funeral home in 1935, and was in business 48 years. And what was it like, the business in town? Everything went along the square. There's always all the grocery stores, barber shops, clothing stores, banking. Everything took place around the square, but there wasn't anything else outside. And the first thing was down South Main Street, where the stores there. There was a gas station there, right on the corner, and then the next building was some insurance, and then later Mary Spring opened a dress shop, and then next was Charlie Casper's grocery store, and it was taken over after he died by Al Menz, and then Lindy's took it over, and that was the first place where Lindy started on the square. And the next door was what we called the Humpty Dumpty. And I don't know if you remember that or not. And that's a gathering space for the young people. And then it was later the bakery of Johnny Leonard had his bakery there. And it had a fire, and that ended Johnny's Bakery. Then next was a hardware store, and first was Dorm Engel, and then Dick Scott had it for a number of years, and then he went to the post office and worked there until he retired. And then down the street was the Gamble store, and next was the grocery store was Mr. Petrie. He had a store there. And also, I think in the same building before that was Kroger's. Not many people know that Kroger's was in Washington, and just a small store. And then also the post office was there. And newcomers in town probably don't know that we had the post office on South Main Street. And then they moved over where the KC building is now, and later to their new building on High Street. And then Dr. Bennett had his office on South Main Street. And then Jack Myers had his Studebaker garage on South Main Street. And Jack always had a cigar in his mouth, but he never lit it up. He always chewed on it. I think he had a cigar all day long. And after that was Dr. Kleinmore, the dentist, had his office there. And these buildings, some of them were torn down. Next door was Russ Sampson home. Very nice two-story home. The next was Zinsser. These homes were torn down for the Heartland Bank and parking area. And of course, it's all changed along South Main Street through the years. And we go over to the south side of the square. The first building is the J.J. Ream Shoe Store, which was in business for a good many years, and the building's now gone, and the space is empty. And we had the South Side Barber Shop, and a man by the name Clemens there. And then later on, Chuck Ryder took it over, and this is where the Aubrey Bird started being the barber also. And then we had Dr. Murray's office, and before that was they had a Washington Reporter, had an office on the south side of the square, and the Reporter was printed here, right here in Washington. And later on, why the business was sold out of town. And then the next was a Southside Restaurant. At one time, the Homer Wabb owned the business, and Slick Smythe had it, and then Chuck Ryder also had it. And then next to that was Ortwine Meat Market. And this was the old-fashioned meat market with sawdust on the floor. And after he died, Mel Finley had the business, and then Dave Doremus. After that, the buildings were torn down, and the new modern buildings on the south side of the square, Chamber of Commerce and Insurance. And then we come to the bank building, which has been restored by Dr. Gross, and that was the Danforth Bank. And he has restored the front of the building, and on the top it has the date of 1897, but the building was built at that time. And then next to that was the vacant lot, and next was Blacksmith Blumenschein. And then Dr. Ferret bought the land there and built his office, and he had another one for rent. Then the restaurant was next. And then across the street was a city building. It was the Danforth Hotel at one time. And then the city took it over, and all the city clerk and the council all met there. That was where all business for the city of Washington took place. Across the hall was the police department, and we had one or two policemen in those days. And this is also the start of the Washington Library in this building. And then in the back they had an auditorium where the high school played basketball, but it wasn't a regulation floor. It was too small. But And then also, we had movies there, I think once a week, and it cost 10 or 15 cents. And the next was the Brunemeyer grocery store. I don't know whether Dennis remembers that or not.
I do, but I do.
Anyway, then the building was tore down, and all that's left of it is the WRC Realtors and the Dean Essick Law Office. Then in the parking lot area, Paul Martin had a garage and he sold Pontiac cars. And it was later torn down. There's a parking lot there now. And the next was Marshall's Restaurant and Tavern. And people used to come from long distance for their chicken dinners there at Marshall's. And it was destroyed by fire back in the 60s. It was never rebuilt. And it's just a parking area now. Then where the Blooming Attic is was the theater. And it was very popular in those days. And when television come, the people stayed home to go to the movie theaters and watch television. So that kind of ended our theater. And next was where the Silco had their office for several years. Before that, I.W. Miller had his undertaking establishment there. And is now Sentimental Journey. And next was Land's Clothing Store. And that was in business for a good many years, Mr. Land. And he had a man by Clarence Zimmerman work for him. And then Clarence took over the business. He had it for several years. And then Michael Gregory was the last owner of it. But when Walmart and Kmart came to business, kind of ruined the clothing business. But then the next was Walt Holland Barber Shop. And he had 2 pool tables in the back room that we all used to gather there in the evenings. His son, Wilford, used to come down and open up, stay till 9 or 9:30, and it was just a meeting place for the young people. And then the next was Savings and Loan, and it's now law office. And then the next was the A&P store. And I don't remember how many years, but George Ringenberger built a building down on Peoria Street in Wood for A&P, and they was located there for several years until they went out of business. And next was Walter Lender Drugstore. And I don't know how many years Walter was in the business. And then the Rexall took it over, and Bill Fry had the drugstore. And then eventually it was closed. The next was the Henry Denhart Bank. And Dr. Tom Gross restored the building. And we have a restaurant there. And we also restored the other 2 buildings just to the east of there. And then on North Main Street, the first building was a 3-story building. And Frank Steinway had his drugstore there also, but it caught fire and they had to tear the rest of the building down. And then Steinway went to the building next to it. There was what is Foster Jewelry now, and he had his drugstore there until Don Groenewald came to town and took over after Frank died. And then the next building is where the Ben Franklin was. Before that, Johnny Leonard was there with his bakery. And this was the Henry Esser building. And on top of the building, you can see the date of 1920, I believe it is. And used to had their ovens in the basement. They had to carry all their baked goods up the steps, and then after Johnny left there, well, he went down where the Humpty Dumpty was. And then Bob Claims took over, had his hardware store there. And then next was Herb's building. They had furniture and appliance store. And then down the ways by Henry had built a building, and we had a first bowling alley uptown. And there was 4 alleys, and it was the gathering place for everybody, and it was full of people every night with league bowling. And in those days, you had to have pin boys set the pins. And the time the 9 o'clock shift come, but the pin boys wore out, and about 11:30, 12 o'clock before you got away from there. And next was Reed's Garage, and everybody remembers the Reeds, Gervin and Willard. And then they retired, and another man took over the building, and it just went down, and they finally had to tear the building down, and the lot is now empty. And the progress Washington has made in the 50s, 60s, 70 years. Lindy had a nice grocery store. Ben Franklin was there, and when they went out of business, Lindy took over the rest of the building. And then you had the Cherry Tree Shopping Center with Kmart and Kroger's. And now you have the new Walmart west of town and Menards. And it makes a big difference in all the different population from 2,500 up to about 13,000, 14,000 now. And this is all taking place in the last 50, 60 years. That's about all I have to say. Thank you.
You forgot one of the important landmarks. That was the bandstand in the middle of town. That has changed enormously too. So.
Yeah.
Well, I don't go back quite as far, but I did learn a couple things. I didn't know that Steinley's burned and he went next door, because I always remember going into Steinley's where Foster Jewelry is now. I didn't know that. And most of those things I've probably either heard about or was at the store. A lot of those stores I was in there, Mary's dress shop was my aunt. That was my dad's older sister. So I remember that very well going in there. But I was born in 1950. Now, I don't know where I was in relationship to the hospital that was in Washington. I don't know when that closed. I was born in Peoria at the hospital, but I talked to people, it seems like 2 or 3 years older than me, that were born in the hospital here in town. So I don't know for sure when that closed, but yeah.
Do you remember when it closed? I don't know where.
Yeah. Did Florence and Max Balls, did they go in there right after the hospital then and had
There was a nursing home in there in 1948 when my grandfather died there.
Okay.
On the main floor, and then upstairs was...
Yeah. Yeah, the nursing home was what was there as I remember it, but I was born in 1950, and we lived on Crestview Drive, which is right off Hilldale there, the short street. That was probably considered a new subdivision at that time. My dad, when he got out of World War II, he had a couple jobs for a short time, and then he opened up a Hot Point appliance store in Washington. And that was where the Knights of Columbus are now. And he sold Hot Point Appliances for, I think, 2 or 3 years, and then he went into the Chrysler Plymouth dealership. And if you look at the Knights of Columbus, you can tell that one big space was a window at one time, and that was his one-car showroom. Now, I don't remember when he was there, but he told me of when Wayne Kinsinger got out of dental school, which would have been probably 48 or 49, Wayne needed space, and Dad had space above him in that building. So Wayne Kinsinger started his dental practice upstairs there before he built the building on South Main. I don't know how long Wayne was up there, but they became very good friends. I don't know if that's how I became a dentist, but Wayne was always my dentist, and I used to spend a lot of time just going down. After I lived on Holland Street, I would go down there and talk with Wayne some days late in the day and just sit and talk. And I think for sure it probably influenced me to do what I ended up doing. But anyway, the first real recollection I have of being at Dad's business was when he opened on Walnut Street, where Mary Levery had her antique place. Dad built that had that built in 1953, and I found a newspaper that I'll lay out here tonight. It just happens to be an issue of the Tazewell County Reporter from November 20th of 52. Has a little article about the 3-day showing on his grand opening, and then inside it has a full page. They're giving away 3 free turkeys and so forth. That's the dealership I really remember. I could go down there, and Dad would have 1 or 2 cars in the showroom and spend time. I mean, as a kid, that was great to go there and hang out in the back where they had the garage and all the tools. I thought that was great. But one of the things I remember on Crestview Drive was we had a milkman then. We had Producer's Milk, and that was Dingledine, Denny Dingledine's dad. Was it Wayne? Wayne Dingledine. And then we also had an Ideal Troy man that came and did Dad's shirts for work and so forth. And the Ideal Troy man, I always remember when he would pull up, I would run out because he had that candy on the paper strip, those little dots that you picked off and ate. So he always would tear off some and hand those to us. So that was a high point, seeing the Ideal Troy man come. But that was where Birchwood is now, east of our house. There was a creek behind our house, and then it was just a cornfield back there. And I do remember houses being built then further on down Crestview Drive. I one time got in serious trouble, though, and I can still remember this. I must have been 4 and a half or 5. I went across the street where Helen Ann's always lived. There was a family named Mosiers that lived there then. It's kind of a house on an angle there that would face the southeast. And they had a dog that I always went over and played with, a big black dog. And apparently they were painting their garage at the time, and the person that was painting left the paint out. And I painted the dog. And now I don't really remember painting the dog, but I remember the results later of what occurred after that. So that was really my first friends were there on Crestview Drive, but we moved before I started grade school. We moved when I was about 5 and a half. I had attended kindergarten at Putnam Shambrooks Kindergarten, which was in the Dickinson house, the big yellow house on South Main. We had kindergarten in the basement there. And that was really where I got a lot of my friends and acquaintances that I kept then for years, because we ended up later all in high school together. But Dad decided in 55, about mid-55, that he wanted to live out in the country. So we bought a house on the County Line Road as you'd head towards Metamora, the 3-mile road, and you'd head east. We were the second house on the right. It was a Schertz house, and it had a big, there wasn't any barn or anything at that time, but it was a big old farmhouse, and So I spent a lot of time there, a lot of fun outdoors. I mean, I loved it out there. So I lived there till 1961, till I would say about when I was 11, we moved back into town. But one of the real highlights that I never forget about living out there is I attended Liberty School, and that was located 2 miles north of town, a one-room schoolhouse. So I went from kindergarten at Putnam Shambrooks to Liberty School, and I thought that was the way school was everywhere. It was a one-room school. You really didn't think about it. First grade, we had 4 in our class. And I think at the peak when I was there, we probably had 25 students or so. We had a teacher, his name was Ralph Kanzler, and Ralph was very, very strict, very strict. And I mean, it was the old days of literally the ruler, you got whacked by it. And I don't think that'd fly today, but that seemed to work back then. I really have excellent memories of that school. I think there were a lot of learning advantages to that because Mr. Kanzler would spend time, say, with first and second grade, then he would move over to third and fourth grade and on up, and you were right there in the same room. You couldn't help hear what was going on, and I think there were real advantages to that. There were real learning advantages because you learned. I always liked math and science, and I can remember back then just listening to the math and watching up on the board as he went to the next class. And as I said, he was very good. One of the highlights was at Christmas, we always put on a play, a whole school play. And he had a curtain that he would put along one end of the room. And we would work, it seemed like, for a week getting ready for this play. And that was just so much fun when you're a little kid. We'd practice our parts, practice our lines. And I'm sure it wasn't very much to watch, 22, 25 of us performing there. But it was a lot of fun, and it was always just became kind of a part of a Christmas memory then. I always liked that a lot. We moved into town, as I said, I'm thinking it was about 61. Well, I should digress a little bit. I went through 5th grade at Liberty School, and then we were the last one-room schoolhouse in Tazewell County to close. So we consolidated with 622 Pleasant View. So I attended Pleasant View School then for 6th grade only, because then we moved into town. I had a great time at Pleasant View School. It seemed huge to me. I got into Pleasant View and I thought, gee, there's different rooms. The classes have different rooms. We have a gymnasium. I thought I was uptown at Pleasant View. And my teacher at Pleasant View was Mrs. Kameyer, who was Carl Kameyer, the pastor at the Lutheran Church at St. Mark's, his wife. Also very strict. So I thought teachers just had to be that way, I guess. So we went there 1 year, and then we moved to town, and we bought Asa Danforth's house on Holland Street, 120 West Holland. And Asa, of course, was the son of Allman that lived on the corner in what was the Habecker Funeral Home. I am right on that, right? Allman and A.G.
Asa was where you lived.
Yeah, Asa was, yeah.
I don't know the other.
Yeah, Asa was the son that lived in it, and I think the father had that house built for him, but I'm not sure. The early pictures, though, if you ever look at that house straight on Holland Street, it's not proportional now. You don't think anything of it, but that whole living room and master bedroom that's on the right side as you face the house was added on. The early pictures of that house, that porch is centered on the house, so that was added on at a later time. But I can remember going in the house and meeting Mrs. Danforth and walking through there, and I was really excited about moving to town because I had friends in town. And that house just seemed like just so much fun. I mean, it had everything when you're a kid you could have, you know, all the little mysterious little places in under the stairs, and I had a lot of fun at that house when I was growing up, for sure. Mrs. Danforth still had a gardener then, and I cannot think of his name, but he he took care of her garden there and the lawn, and he stayed on a couple years after Dad bought the house and kind of helped with the garden until he got too elderly and it was just too much for him anymore. But I would talk to him a lot, had a lot of fun with him out in the yard. And but when we moved into town, let's see, I was starting 7th grade then. So 7th and 8th grade, I attended Washington Grade School on Spruce Street. And again, seemed like a huge move to me. I mean, that grade school seemed monstrous after 622. We had 2 levels, and I'm going to kind of get into now to what the town seemed like to me at that time. And one of the things that I can remember, a lot of the spots, obviously, on the square. When you talk, Mel, about Ream's Shoe Store, you've probably all heard this or remember this, but those fluoroscope or whatever he had that you could look at your feet, I don't know what that did to us. I'm sure it cooked us in some way, or some way the genes are messed up now. But we used to just stand there and think that was the greatest thing. You could go in there and do that. And I ended up working at Lindy's like the kids do now. They all get a job at Lindy's, and I got a job at Lindy's when they were in the 2-row store that Mel talked about there on the square. And Florence, Jim's mom, would always cook food for us at dinner time. She would feed us because we got off at 8 or so and closed up the store. But, I mean, it was just a family operation, and at dinner time we all went in the back and ate together, and that was truly a good experience for me. I had friends that worked then for Don, because Don had taken over Steinley's at that time, Don Gronwald, so I had a lot of friends that worked there, and Don through the years employed many, many students like that. One of the things I remember, Mel, when you mentioned the theater, we would walk up to the square for the shows then, and you know, TV was not a big deal. I think we had 3 channels then, so it wasn't really too big a deal. We still went to movies. But one night there was supposedly a scary horror movie that was going to be on in town, and it was a weekend, and I'm thinking I was probably 11, 12 years old. We hadn't lived in town very long, so I was going to meet my friends up there. So we walked up to the theater. When I got there, the lights that are usually on in the lobby, after you buy your ticket, you went in, there was a small lobby there, and you could get the candy and popcorn off on the right. Well, the lights were real low, and off on the left was a casket. And the casket was just propped open a little bit, and there was a rubber hand hanging out of it. Automatically, I mean, immediately, all of us are petrified. We're not even sure we want to go in and see this movie. So we did end up going in, and it was, I can remember the name of the movie was, it had Ray Milland in it, Premature Burial. This guy gets buried alive. I'll tell you what, I barely made it through the movie. All my friends, of course, they lived north of the square. I live south. So I don't know what time it was. It's dark. I get out of there, and I've got to walk home. Petrified. I have to walk by Mel's funeral home, and then I have to turn the corner and walk by Habecker's funeral home. By the time I got home, I'm shaking, probably didn't sleep a wink that night. That's by far my biggest memory of the Tazewell Theater. I started high school in fall of 64 and got out in 68, so some of the teachers I had were classics. Some of you might know them. I don't know why, it just seemed like an era, and I've talked to teachers at the school that, you know, have recently retired and knew these teachers and really had some classics. I had, if any of you remember Bill Morris, I had Bill for physics. And Bill lived on South Main, upstairs in the yellow house, the Dickinson house. He and his wife lived there. And Bill, though, at times would sleep at the high school. and he slept in the room that was connected the physics room to the chemistry room. There was a little storage room in between, and Bill would sleep there. So I always had physics first thing in the morning, so sometimes we would get to physics class and Bill would just be coming out. He'd be putting his tie on and combing his hair, and he's ready for the day. And we really didn't think that much of it. I mean, now that'd be so bizarre. We didn't think that was that strange, I guess. I had a really nice lady for Latin. I took 2 years of Latin because I knew I wanted to go into something in science, and Mary Kemmerer was her name. She was the nicest lady, and I learned Latin really well. She was an excellent teacher, and I really thought a lot of her. I had Charlie Burton for chemistry, and Charlie was kind of in the room about half the time and half the time not. Well, he didn't know that dealing with boys that age and you're in a chem lab, you better be there. Well, one day we were working with the Bunsen burners, which you had on there all the time, and we were cutting pieces of glass tubing, and we would roll those in the Bunsen burner to make the end of them smooth once you cut them off. And I got the idea of putting one of these glass tubings on the hose, and we made about a 3-foot piece, and then we lit the end of it there. So we had this nice torch there. Well, somebody had caramel candy they were eating on, so he said, let's see if we can melt that. Well, of course you're going to melt it with a Bunsen burner. We put that in the sink and put the torch on it. Well, I didn't know, none of us knew, back then those old sinks were lead. So we're sticking our Bunsen in there, we're having a good time, and the candy's melting. All of a sudden, clunk, that whole sink just dropped right out to the floor. Well, Charlie comes back about that time. I mean, he laid into my partner and I, which I didn't even know Charlie could get upset, because he never got too mad with anybody. And then I spent a little time down in Mr. Abernathy's office. I don't think any of them could believe it, and my dad got the call, which I knew he would, but made it through that somehow. But I can remember the next day we were in class when Hexamer showed up, the plumber, to look at it. And I can remember his language when he walked in and saw that sink. He could not believe what in the world happened here. And I just happened to be sitting there, so I have to explain the whole thing then to the plumber who's going to fix the sink. Let's see, who else did I had, for biology, I had Doc Reynolds, and I think he probably was done about my junior year. He'd been there a long time. Doc seemed pretty ancient to high school kids, but he was a good teacher. He was very good and got a lot out of it. But I decided then, when I got out of high school, I always kind of thought I thought a little bit about dental school, but I talked a lot with Don Gronwald, and he talked me into going to pharmacy school. I thought I might really like that. So Don took me up one time to the University of Illinois in Chicago to show me where he went to school. I ended up applying at Butler, and to Drake University in Des Moines had a pharmacy school. So I ended up going to Drake. Before I got out of school, I really realized I wasn't sure I wanted to be a pharmacist, thought I wanted to go into medicine. One of my counselors talked to me and he said, if you want to have a family, you want to have your own business, you'll have time. Did you ever think about dentistry? I said, well, yeah, I did a little bit, just because I think because I knew Wayne real well, and I also knew Bud Engel real well. So that's how it happened. I ended up then going to Illinois, and he said the courses are pretty similar first year. Try it. If you don't like it, you can switch to med school. So that's how I ended up in dentistry. So I think that is a few of my memories of life. So.
Thank you.
Let's see.
Well, As you can see, this nice young gentleman had no notes down here, and I have a whole page full because I don't remember things very well. I want to kind of start out by talking about my mom. She was a phenomenal lady. I'm the 6th generation Washingtonian. We go way back. Anyway, my mom and dad moved to the farm out at the end of Cummings Lane in 1936, and they bought it from the Hartley family. Now, the Hartleys made their own bricks, and they had a huge kiln that they made these bricks. They built the house, they built barns out there. I think some of their bricks were used for some of the streets in Washington, too. And they were a really neat family. We saw pictures of them from their family, and the girls were very, very pretty. They had very pretty dresses. And Joe Hartley, as you probably remember, used to drive the old car around town. He was a very nice-looking young man. I mean, which I'm not saying he wasn't nice-looking when he was older, but when he was young, he was very nice-looking. And they were a very interesting family. And we used to ride around the property, of course, when my mom and dad bought it. We found a tombstone up on a hill of one of their children, it was like in I don't remember exactly the date, and the child was 2 years old. So, of course, I could just visualize them up on the hill, and the ladies in their long, dark dresses and everything, which was kind of sad but they were a neat family. Mom and Dad moved out there, and they did a lot of landscaping and stuff and changed the house a little bit, but not a whole lot. They had a steeplechase out there in the Hiles property, which was right next to my mom and dad's, and they had people from all around the country come. Steeplechase is like a horse race, except they jump over fences. And it was really neat. And Steeplechase Estates is named because of the steeplechase that was close by there. So that was a really neat time. My mom started a business when she was 50 years old, and she did it until she was 75. And she gave horseback riding lessons. Now, I will tell you her routine that she did until she was 75. And some mornings I can't get out of bed at 7 o'clock, so I feel really bad. I don't take after my mom. But anyway, she had 17 horses. Some of them were hers, some of them were border. She had 3 different barns. And she would get up in the morning, and she'd go down and she'd feed the horses, and she'd go up and have breakfast with my dad. Then she'd go down, she'd clean all the stalls. She did lessons from 9 to noon, go up and have lunch with my dad, come back from 1 o'clock till 5, more lessons. She'd feed the horses, go have dinner with my dad, come out and clean the stalls. She did that 6 days a week. The only time she took time off was a little bit of Christmas and a little bit of Thanksgiving. So she did that all that time. She was phenomenal. She's a little tiny little lady, and everyone would say, you don't look anything like your mom, and I got the hint what they were talking about. And I'd say, yes, I know. Taking the other side of the family, my dad's side or something. Anyway, she not only did she give lessons, but she also started the Riding for the Handicapped in this area, which was absolutely her joy. She's investigated it all. She got all the information, and so she would do all this every day, and then after that she would give the Riding for the Handicapped. She got the volunteers, which were very nice ladies in Washington, came out and would help her do that because they always needed a lot of help. And the children from the people that would bring the children out would also help out. But anyway, she would do that. She had Eureka College students that came over. She was an amazing lady. She was in the paper, Peoria paper, 4 times. She was in the paper here, I think, a couple of times at least. But the Riding for the Handicap was really what she really had her heart and soul into. But what's neat about it is to this day, people will come up and say to me, my child would not be where they are today if it wasn't for your mom. Tons of people say that all the time. She had some kind of troubled shoulder that came out, and they never did anything bad. I mean, and after Mom passed away, I asked one of the kids, I said, what was it that kept you from not misbehaving? And they said, well, we wouldn't do that to Mrs. Cummings. So I think the trick that my mom has is she was a listener. And she was very good at it. She would listen to whatever they had to say. She never told her, she would just listen, and then she'd give her advice. And she had ladies that would come out, and she'd say to the ladies, I can't teach you anything more. And they'd say, well, you're cheaper than a psychiatrist. So they just kept coming. And they would ride, Mom would talk, and, it's kind of like, okay, if that's what you want. But my dad at that time was not in very good health, so she did most all of that herself. She just was a really cool lady. She had 48 lessons a week. She would do that in 6 days. So, but the farm was an interesting place. We had we had all kinds of animals. It was like an old folks' home for animals, because someone would have a horse they didn't want, they'd bring it off the farm. They'd have an animal they didn't want, and then everybody dumped their animals. It was just pathetic. But she had a horse, found a horse that it was being mistreated, and they had just abandoned it. So Mom went over and got the horse, and she brought it back, and she put it in one of the stalls, and it was trotting around. We thought it had kind of a grass belly on it, so we're kind of looking. Well, the next day we went out, and the grass belly was a foal running around after the mare, and we stood there and we thought, we didn't know anything about the stallion, and so my dad named it Who's My Paw, because we didn't know who the paw was. So it was born on the farm and it died on the farm, so Who's My Paw was there forever, and Mom used her all the time. Monsignor Beebe took lessons from my mom, and he said he was on the ground more than he was on the horse. He said your mom would turn around and help him back on. But anyway, when my mom passed away, he gave the most wonderful talk at my mom's funeral, but one thing he did say, it says, Ella believed that those who could not walk could ride, and in riding, some would learn to walk. That was just one of Ella's miracles. The greater miracles took place in the hearts of her students. And I think that was exactly what she was. She was a phenomenal lady. Now, some of my memories of Washington, I am a vegetarian, and people have asked me why you're a vegetarian. And I can tell you how it started. When I was young, my family, well, I'll tell you a story about, Mother had a rooster named Buster. And Buster, she'd put him in the tack room at night, let him out in the morning. She went in one morning and Buster was just sitting there. And she thought, well, she didn't know what was wrong with him, so she called the vet and she said, I don't know what's wrong with Buster. We don't know whether something's wrong with him or if he's old. She said, how old do roosters live? And the vet said, well, Mrs. Cummings, I don't know because I've never known one to die of old age. So that kind of tells you how we were with animals. So when I was little, I never connected when I was eating the meat that the meat was actually an animal. I mean, I've always been this big animal lover. It didn't dawn on me until I went into Finley's Market. And I walked in, and in the case was a tongue. And I went, oh my gosh. And I said to my mother, she said, so she explained to me that, yes, that was the beef and that was the tongue. So that was the first nail in the coffin. The second one was, I believed everything everyone told me. And they told me in those days, in the restaurants and stuff, they didn't have the health department like they do now. And a lot of the guys, they would have like a beater shirt on, I mean, it wasn't anything that like it is now. Well, they told me that they would take the hamburger, the cooks, and go like this, and they'd put it under their arm, and then they'd flop it on the grill. That was the second nail. And it was just downhill until I became a vegetarian because I thought, I don't want to know anything more about it. And you were talking about Green Shoe Store. That was, my brother says that the reason there's nothing on there now is because there's much radiation in the ground. We're all in your shoes all the time. And the other thing was we had a ringworm. I didn't know what ringworm was. I don't know if anyone now that is Washington. And you did not put your head back against any seat, particularly in the theater, because you might get ring-worm. I didn't know what it was, but it didn't sound good. So to this day, and I leaned back, I put something behind my head, and I kind of got over the ring-worm scare, but it's so embedded, and I thought if I died and I was at some place, I would go forward. All the years just don't go back because of the ringworm kind of a deal. It was not, you know. And in Paul's Grocery, I can remember Paul's Grocery because what was, and you know, I think, you look at Schnucks, and then you look at Paul's Grocery. What are they buying now that they didn't buy back then? I mean, you know, it's like a block, and this was like Paul's Grocery was go like this. But what they would do, and a lot of people probably remember this, is they would write down everything and then the price, but they had carbon paper. I thought carbon paper was absolutely phenomenal. I mean, it's like carbon paper, and we used to go to my dad's store and dig through the things to find carbon paper that we could take home, and we could write on the, you know, between the carbon paper. That was just a really big deal about the carbon paper. Anyway, kind of sad. And I can remember the monkey in Mickey's Diner. And my mom wouldn't let us go in. I couldn't understand why. And then in Peoria, there was a pet store that had a monkey. And I didn't understand why they would not buy me the monkey, because we live in the country. I mean, how much more perfect could that be? So anyway, but I didn't ever get the monkey. Now, of course, it was either that or the skunk. So two things that were, kind of interesting. Anyway, we had a really good time. We used to go to the homecoming, and we would ride our horses through, which is now, well, where you live. I can't even think of the name of the... Firethorn, yes. We'd ride through there, and then we'd go and ride our horses in the homecoming parade, and that was a really big deal for us for the homecoming, because we got to get out early, which was always a big deal also. But the thing that was really interesting was when I was in grade school, there was a young man named Ricky Walker, and he won a spaceship. Now, it was, of course, a trailer, but we just thought, and we got to walk uptown with the helmets on that you could see out, but no one could see in. And we thought, oh my gosh, that was so cool. And I always thought, I wonder if they took that someplace, what people would think if they're driving down the road with this spaceship thing behind them. Someone said they took the spaceship apart. I never knew what happened to Ricky Walker. And so if anyone ever finds out, we want to know if he went into the space program or if he just kind of, just kind of left or something. I don't know. But, and then one time they had the pool hall down the basement of this one. Well, we thought it was a really big deal. We wanted to see what the pool hall, but I guess girls didn't go down the pool hall or something because you just weren't supposed to get down the pool hall. And I think of kids today, I think of us, we ran down, a bunch of girls ran down at the bottom of the steps, screamed, and ran back up again. We just thought, we were like, oh my gosh, we were really wild, just like, oh, give me a break. But also, when we were young, go out and play, and no one checked on us. I mean, we'd go out in the morning, we'd come back at noon, and then you'd leave at noon, but no one ever checked on you. I mean, I sometimes wonder when we had a lake that was rather far away from our house. We used to ice skate on it, and Mom never checked on us. I mean, I kind of wondered, well, wait a minute, is she not wondering, caring whether we fall in the thing or something? But anyway, but we used to pretend, and then we used to have an imagination. And I think with all the things the kids have now, which I am not familiar, blueberry, blackberry, pinkberry, whatever the heck they all have, what they kind of miss, I think, would be your imagination. And because you could be anything you wanted to be. You could go anywhere you wanted to go. And it was really nice. And the boys would have a baseball game at the corner lot. No umpires, no parents, just fun. And I'm thinking that was such a neat way to live. I don't know if kids would be kind of bored now probably with that whole thing, but I just, and Goat Springs, I never went to Goat Springs, but a lot of kids talked about walking out to Goat Springs. And there again, I mean, you wouldn't let your kids walk down the railroad track now to go anywhere, and when I take my nieces and nephews, they're like Velcroed to my body. I'm so afraid someone's going to take them, they don't get away from, like that. But we used to just go out and play and have a good time. Had a lot of fun in Washington. At the Fall Festival up on the square was always a lot of fun and all that kind of stuff. But my mom had one story that was kind of, Diane said about telling it, because my mom had a shotgun that she kept upstairs because she lived alone. And the doorbell rang, and she called out the window, "Who's there?" Nothing. Doorbell rang again. She said, "Who's there?" Again, nothing. So the third time it rang, she said, "I have a shotgun up here, and I'm going to call the police if you don't tell me who you are." And she looked, and a big raccoon was coming down off the steps. And Mother says, "I was threatening a raccoon." It was Everybody had seen the light on the thing and was ringing the doorbell. Anyway, the farm was a magical place. It was absolutely phenomenal. I love it. I miss it terribly. My heart is there. It always will be. A lot of good times there. The Hartley did a very good job of bringing it to us, and then my mom and dad, and so it was very nice. And I love living in Washington. A lot of my family's still here, and I've enjoyed my time. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. Kind of a hard thing for me to do, but here I am. And I have a story to tell, and I'm going to sort of read it because I tend to ramble, and so that way you won't be here all night. My earliest impressions of Washington go back to happy days of my childhood and youth. As a little girl, I was born and raised in Metamora, and I loved to come with my family to the band concerts in the park on the square. I well remember the quaint bandstand where the fountain now sits, and the sounds of the music of the band on a summer night was wonderful. The cars would honk for their applause, and my dad would give us a nickel or a dime to go have an ice cream treat. Another early memory was the theater that has been mentioned. We used to come to movies a lot in Washington. My older sister, during World War II, her fiance was in the Pacific Islands serving, and so she would bring me or my siblings or my friends, and we'd come to the movie, which we really enjoyed. And later years, we would go to Marshall's next door sometimes and have their wonderful chicken. And they had something new and innovative. They served chicken in a basket, and that's the first I remember of ever having that. I remember, too, even as a young girl, I just really liked to look at pretty homes. And whenever we came to Washington, I always would look at one of my favorite houses out on the north edge of town. It was a lovely little Cape Cod home, white with green shutters with a picket fence, neat as a pin. Do you know whose home I'm thinking of?
Lytle.
Mrs. Lytle and I really, this was a surprise, but we became very dear friends as we worked on the historical restoration of the Zinsser home and the doctor's office. A couple of churches, too, played into my childhood or youth, too. When I was a little girl, we used to come here and give our piano recitals with Mrs. Laura Wepner. Do any of you remember her? Yeah. She lived right close here. Anyway, she was a wonderful, wonderful piano teacher, and we would give our recitals here because she lived close by. Most probably important of all would be the Calvary Mennonite Church. I used to come with my best girlfriend, who lived in Metamora but went to that church, Joanne Steiner, and I would often come with her, and it was also the church where Vern Strubart went. And he would often bring his good buddy, Bob Summer. Chuckle, chuckle. And so, as fate would have it, one Sunday evening we happened to meet. And I thought he was cool. He had this really outgoing personality and his great smile. And I also thought he was a very sharp dresser. In those days, here he was like 20 years old. Sunday night, he had on this really dapper suit and a really sharp tie. And I mean, we've come a long way from that sort of thing. And that was my first impression of Bob Summer. And it was very positive. So we began dating, and we did have a lot of fun. I learned to know his friends and many stories about Washington. Soon, when we were dating, he took me to the drugstore that you mentioned there, that Mr. Tully owned. And the Tully family were great fun. Bob and Tom Tully were good friends, and so he took me in to meet them, and Mr. Tully would say always something like, well, this isn't the girl you had last night, Mom. He'd always have something terrible to say, and they had so much fun with him. I think one time he was giving him a bad time, and Vern and Bob just bodily carried him outside, put him outside, and it was cold. But Tom was so much fun. And I never did witness this, but Bob would tell me how he never had he always worked for all his money when he was a kid, and an adult too. But he would go in and he'd see Tom at the soda fountain, and he'd say, Tom, I just have a one dip ice cream cone. So he'd be fixing him his cone, and he'd say, anybody ever tell you what a good-looking guy you are? So Tom would deep reach in and put another cone in. And then he'd say, did you ever think of going in the movies or anything? And that physique of yours. And he'd walk out of there with a huge cone for the price of one. So they had a lot of fun. We dated off and on through our college years, and we both majored in education. I went to ISU, and he went to Eureka College. And he served 2 years in the military during the Korean War. And then he received his master's degree from the U of I. We were married in 1954, and our wedding took place here in Washington in the old EUB church, which is no longer there. We began getting together soon with some couples whose friendships we've continued over all these years. One couple's right here, Malin and Carolyn. And we would meet regularly for dinner and go to dessert at one of our homes. And over coffee and dessert, inevitably, the conversation would turn to memories of Washington, because most of the guys were from Washington. And we girls would roll our eyes and say, here we go, down memory lane again. But really, we loved it, and even though we heard the same stories many times. One of the good stories was back in the 30s, when Bob was really young, and they had the famous turkey tossing of turkeys off of the roof of the old Ben Franklin building. They would do this for anybody who could catch them, and Bob's brother, Arden, caught one and took it home, and they kept it in a little pen till Thanksgiving. And then, so his mother fixed the turkey for Thanksgiving, and Bob had become attached to the bird, and he could not eat a bite. And then another story that we heard was always of the cow in the city building, and you've all heard that one, I'm sure. And Halloween stories and pranks that the guys did, and sports stories, and they're just it was just kind of like Norman Rockwell town, I think. One thing that I found a little appalling was the nicknames of these people, these guys. I'll tell you a few of them, and you've probably heard them all. Suitcase Simpson, Haircut Hansen, Stink Blair, Duck Lang, Baggy Blumenshine, sorry Baggy, Hoot Alexander, and Hoot went with the girl they called Toot. So it was, well, I mean, she was Tootie Meyer, but they'd talk about Hoot and Toot. Anyway, but you know, they had so much fun, and something about I know Bob was an only child. His brother died when he was 12, so he was an only child from then on. And I think he loved Washington so much because he was just uptown all the time with his buddies. And, you know, he didn't have, his parents both worked, and so he was kind of, I don't want to say he was a street kid, but he was just uptown all the time, having a great time. So I was beginning to see what a great town Washington is. And even though I came from Metamora, there was no place in our marriage for any kind of Metamora, Washington rivalry. With his infectious fan that he was, my blood was turning orange. Let's see what I have next. Okay. When we were first, oh, wait a minute. I'm getting myself mixed up here. Okay. When we were first married, we lived just for a few years in Morton, where Bob coached all sports without any assistance. And I taught kindergarten in Metamora, so I drove that long distance every day. And I had 40 kindergartners in the morning and 41 in the afternoon. And I think now that we were both just nuts, but we both loved what we did. And I just happened to have that large kindergarten because St. Mary's had no kindergarten at that time, so they pooled into the public school. The next year, then they had their school, and then it was just a regular 25 or 26 children. But the plan was that I would teach for a while, and Bob would coach because he really loved it. And he had very successful years, and so everything was great. But then babies started coming, and we both, the salaries back then are laughable, really, for all that we did and all he did. And so he received some opportunities to go into business, and so he decided he would do that. And that brought us back to Washington. The first home that we had here was we bought in 1958. It was a small house at the end of a string of homes being built in a new subdivision, Devonshire Estates. And open fields were all around us except the first street. We were at the end of the street. So we thought it was great. I think we paid $13,000 for our home. And now our third child was born here. Now we had Lynn, Tommy, and Bobby, and a variety of pets and fun neighbor kids. Bill was one of our neighbors. We had a great time. At this time, besides being in the insurance business, Bob was teaching algebra and geometry at the high school. And I was just a mom at home, but then there was quite a critical shortage of teachers, and so I went back to teaching at Lincoln School, where my children were, and I taught first grade there. And that was really a wonderful thing for me. Everybody I just knew I was Bob Summers' wife, and I didn't know half the people in town that knew me. And so it was really nice for me to become more involved myself in the community. And I really did love that. And being in school, the same school as my children, was just ideal. At that time, Earl Heater was the principal, and Don Uphoff over at the Washington School, and Bob Paxson was the superintendent. So those were the years. After our years on Devonshire Road, we kind of wanted a larger home, and so we moved to Hilldale, where we we purchased the home that Mel Maley was just selling. And it is not really a historic home, but it's an older home, and we love that home. It was a farmhouse there. I think they said it was like a turkey farm. And then all of those Cape Cods were built around it. So that's why it's kind of an unusual home there with on that street. Those are my favorite memories, raising our family in this great town. And we felt our children had really good times. I forgot, I could tell so many things about, like Goat Springs. My boys used to go camp up there, and I never thought anything. Be careful, go on, have fun. But anyway, I think our children had great times, and I think they were well prepared here in the schools for their various colleges and eventual careers. Our daughter Lynn is here, and she became a nurse, and our son Tom is a surgeon, and our son Bob is a teacher. And I'm very thankful that Lynn and her husband, Mark Swisher, live here close to me and raised their children here. Tom and his family live in Lafayette, Indiana, and Bob and his wife and 3 daughters live in Alaska. We had a teacher when the kids were in school named Bob Silverthorne. I don't know if any of you remember him, but he told stories about Alaska. I think he was from Alaska. And my son Bob couldn't hear enough of it. And I still think I'd like to tell Bob Silverthorne. Because my son loves Alaska, and I go up to see him every summer if I can. I'm planning to this year. But I thought he'd go up there and get it out of his system, but he really, really loves living there. So while we lived on Hilldale those years, we became grandparents. Our children are all married and had their children, so we have 10 grandchildren. I could tell stories about that, but I'm allotted not that much time. My husband is the one who had the best stories to tell of Washington. I wish he could be here. He could really entertain you. Sadly, his Washington life story ended on the morning of 9/11, very early that morning, that fateful day. But I think he's one of those rare people that was born and lived and died in the same town. I mean, that's sort of a rarity nowadays with people moving all over. And he would so appreciate what has happened and taken place in these past 9 years since he left us. He would be amazed at the growth, and he'd be delighted with the progress that's happening and the improvements, and especially all the improvements on the square, on our historic square. I know he would really appreciate that. He would be using and loving 5 Points like I do. We did build a home in Firethorn subdivision 19 years ago, and we lived there 10 years together. That was an area that Bob and Mel Maley subdivided and developed, and I still live in that home. And until my life story is over, I'll be grateful to God for the good years that my family and I have had here in Fort Washington. I didn't move here till I was in my 20s, but I've lived here 50 years, and you said you didn't have to be born here. And so I think I probably qualify as a Washingtonian. Thank you for letting me share my story.
Thank the panel members for their interesting stories. And we have one other person who's with us tonight. Those of you who knew Clarence Brennan Meyer, we have a representative of his family, his son Dan. And we're just fortunate that we happen to have a program while he's here for his father's celebration of life service, and he agreed to share the story of his father's life. And so Dennis is going to do that now, and then afterwards you're welcome to ask people questions during coffee and cookies and mingle.
I have to tell you, I was recruited this morning. So if I'd have known this was happening, I would have come better prepared, because I have a lot of materials that I just took over to Morton to ship back to California that I brought here from my father's celebration of life that we had yesterday. There's a lot of photographs, some of them quite old. But the story began, well, let me start with one other thing first. About 2 years ago, maybe a year and a half ago, we started getting interested again in our genealogy here in Washington. And I want to commend Carol Dorwood for her immense amount of help. And I would like to hear a round of applause for her, because she's been real helpful for us. Two other things. I'm really pleased to see that we have a Washington Historical Society. I think that is an enormous step forward, and I'm really pleased to see so many people here. Now, I live in California, but I was born and raised here in Washington, and I've always thought this was a pretty neat town. And I'm really pleased to see that people are interested in the history of the town. And I'm also pleased to see that people like Tom Gross have done what they've done downtown. I would really like to see the rest of the downtown area restored like that. I don't think that's all practical, but it certainly was encouraging to see what has been done so far. When I was here, I was born in 1940, and I grew up here and went to the University of Illinois, but I left here in 1958. I thought Washington was a pretty neat town, and I still do. I think that there's a book, the Washington Postcard Series book, that covers a lot of the old buildings that are no longer here or have been covered up with other facades. And one of my dreams would be to see more of those restored to that kind of that shape and configuration. But the Brunnenmeyer story begins back in Germany in the late 1700s, 1799. But the Brunnenmeyers came here in 1840, about 1849. And they came from an area in Bavaria called, well, near Dinkelsbühl, a little town called Weisweiler. And two brothers came. Well, let me back up, actually. A sister came first. We don't know where she came to. We don't know if she ever came to Washington, but she was apparently a black sheep in the family. She had 3 illegitimate children, and all 4 of them embarked for the United States or Canada, we're not sure, in 1847. In 1850, my great-grandfather and his brother came to the United States, and they came, we think, with a young woman by the name of Marie Christina Springer, who lived near Weisweiler in Germany, about 2 miles away. Villages in that part of Bavaria are very close together, and they're very small. There may be 4 or 5 houses in a village, maybe 10. The Germans also at that time used their middle name as their call name. One of the brothers that came was Johann Friedrich Brunnenmeyer. The other brother was Johann Jakob Brunnenmeyer, which is John Jacob and John Fred, or John Friedrich. But they both were, first name was actually Johann. That's quite common. And the same was true of the women. Marie Christina was called Christina, but her first name was Marie. So they came to the United States, and I don't know if they came together or not, but shortly after they arrived here, Johann Jakob married Marie Christina. And now the document I have here says Eureka. I think it was actually at the courthouse in Metamora. But they were married in 1850. And they had built a cabin out in 10 Mile Timber on Liberty Lane, not too far from, there's some sort of I don't know what it is, a resort or a camp area, right in that general area. Built a log cabin, and that's where my grandfather was born, and along with a whole bunch of others. One of the children was Johann Heinrich, John Henry. The one was Johann Harry. One was Theodor Heinrich, which was my grandfather. He was born in that log cabin out there on Liberty Lane in 1856, my grandfather. So that brings us up to my grandfather. On the other side of the family, Eva Friedricha Seibold came from Germany, along with her husband, separately, of course. John, well, I don't know what his full name was, actually. It was John Zimmerman, though. And they had children. They had farms out in the area between Washington and Metamora. They had children, and one of those was my grandmother, Wilhelmina Zimmerman, who married Theodor Heinrich, also known as Henry. So Henry and Wilhelmina were married in 1891, I believe it was. He was a typical Brunnenmeyer. He was about 52 and she was 23, something like that. But he was quite old when he was married. That explains why my father was born then as Clarence Rudolph Brunnenmeyer. Now, he would roll over in his grave if he heard me say that. He denied having a middle name of Rudolph. He went so far as to take a razor blade to all the documents that had his middle name in it and slice out the middle name. In 1965, he actually got an affidavit to officially change the birth certificate, which I managed to acquire a few days ago in Onampekan, officially changed the name to drop the Brunnenmeyer, or drop the Rudolph. But anyway, back to where I was. Dad was born in 1906, and as a young child, he grew up, of course, here in Washington. He had ponies from Hiles. Hiles, every summer, Hile Pony Farm would issue a pony to various children who would take care of the pony all summer long. They have new foals in the spring, and they'd get the pony, and they'd raise it, and they'd get to ride it eventually. They kept that pony on North Spruce Street, where my grandfather's home was. When my grandfather was farming, he eventually got injured. He injured a foot and apparently had to quit farming and moved into town. Had a home on North Spruce Street. If you go out there now, there's a log house there, which was built by the Martins. That's a story about that in a minute. But that's where my father was basically born, and all of his sisters and brothers, which explains why there were so many people here yesterday for the celebration of life. This whole state is full of offspring from mainly my brothers, my dad's sisters. But anyway, where was I? Okay, so my father was born in that house on Spruce Street, and he went to the first grade and then the new school on South Spruce, which is only about a block and a half away. Miss Mary Edelin was his teacher, and he had the pony, of course, and he used to work for one of his uncles on his mother's side. Wilhelmina was known as Minnie Zimmerman Brunnenmeyer, or just Minnie Brunnenmeyer, and one of the uncles was Uncle Fred, and Uncle Fred had the round barn at the end of South Spruce Street, which is no longer here, unfortunately. But Dad used to work there, and the only broken bone Dad ever had was when he fell off the ramp to the round barn one time, and then Uncle Fred put a railing up after that. But Dad used to tell me about driving the cans of milk over to Peoria. Every day he would go up there as a small child, maybe 10 or 12. They'd give him horses and a wagon and milk cans in the back of the wagon. And he'd drive them to Peoria and deliver the milk over there where it was processed. He said he didn't have to do much because the horses knew the way. He just sat in the wagon, basically, and they would take him over there, and then he'd deliver the milk, and they'd bring him back. But he went to one of the few high school students. He graduated from Washington High School in the Spruce Street area in 1924. He played on the first football team in 1923. Now, there was a football team, not a football team really, but there was some football played earlier than that, like in 1908. Somebody got injured. It wasn't really an official team. They played in a cow pasture out between Elm Street and South Main Street on the other side of the creek. And it was kind of ruts and stuff like that. And somebody got hurt. They twisted their ankle or something, so they decided they weren't going to have a football team after all. But in 1923, they did have an official football team. And I did have one of the original photographs of that team at the Celebration of Life yesterday at the Denhart Washington Room. And sure enough, there was Dad in there. But he went to the University of Illinois, which was, at that time, not very many people went to the university. 1 in 40, roughly, from around here went to college. And he worked his way through for a few years, got in debt with his father, or with his uncle, I should say, and finally dropped out because he figured that he owed $600 to Uncle Harry, and that was a lot of money in those days, about $7,500 in today's terms. So Dad went off to work with an uncle in Chicago for a while. Then he got a job with Kresge's in Cincinnati. Came to Marion, got transferred to Marion, Indiana, where on a blind date he met my mother. And it was just a few months later they were married and came back to, this was during the Depression, so they came back to Washington, lived in Farmington for a while, came back to Washington and built a house on South Main Street, which is where I wasn't born there, but that's where grew up. I was actually born in Proctor Hospital. But I did go to first grade in Carrie Foster's one-room schoolhouse, which is on Peoria Street on the south side, was on the south side, just before you get to South Market Street on the left. There's whose offices are there?
A&P building? Professional building. Professional building.
Yeah, right in there. There was a one-room schoolhouse. And Brad was talking about stern teachers. Miss Foster, Carrie Foster, was also very stern, and she did break a meter stick over my head. She literally did. I don't remember what I was doing, but I'm sure I deserved it. But I remember that schoolhouse well. There was a merry-go-round outside, the kind of the center pivot. All the kids get on the rim and run around in a circle and get it spinning and then jump on. And there were a couple swings. And my grandfather's house up there on North Spruce Street occupied 2 lots of property. And Grandpa was that kind of guy that grew had cherry trees, had a lot of vegetables, and had a wine press in the cellar. They served wine to everybody at the dinner table, including children. If they wanted a little glass of wine, they could have a glass of wine. He also was stern. He said, if your feet are under my table, you do as I say, to the kids. There was no, you do as I say as long as you're here, as long as you're living here. So. But I remember my grandfather, only very briefly, he was in the nursing home when he died, but just before that he lived in our house on South Main Street for, I don't know, maybe 6 months. And I could remember he had a cane, and he would sit there in his rocking chair. And every now and then I'd walk by, and he'd open his little black leather purse, a little coin purse, reach in and pull out a nickel and give it to me. That's about all I remember of him, except for one other story. This is kind of interesting, actually. Few people believe this, but it's absolutely true. The house on North Spruce Street had a stone foundation, which had a lot of holes in the chinks, and the mortar was missing or whatever. And there was a bumblebee nest under the house. And he says, we're going to get these bumblebees. And he took a 5-gallon stoneware jug, which has the small neck. It goes out like this and down cylindrical. It has a handle with the ring, He filled it half full of water and laid it on its side so that the opening of the jug was adjacent to the hole in the foundation. So bees would come by. Bumblebees aren't really very smart. And a few of them would mistake the hole in the jug for their den, or the entrance to the den. They'd go in there. And a bumblebee does not realize that the light over there in the opening is the way out. They don't think that way. They'd fly around in there, and eventually they'd get their wings wet, and they'd lay in the water and buzz, which only attracted more bees. Before you know it, all the bumblebees were going into the jug instead of into the foundation. And the next day, we'd dump the jug out, and there'd be 3 or 4 dozen bees would fall out. and that would be the end of the bees for a while. And I always thought that was kind of neat. No one ever believed me, though, and I saw it myself. I couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old, but that's deeply embedded in my mind. But I do remember some of the businesses that were on the square. One of them was John Henry's grocery store, and that was Uncle John to my father. This is Dad's brother. And Theodore Heydrich, or known as T. Henry, or Henry to most people, would hang out there quite a bit in his older years. Another Brunenmeyer, Russell Brunenmeyer, tells a story about going in there and sneaking a dill pickle out of the barrel every now and then, because that was always a special treat when they brought in the fresh pickles. But I remember going in there. I can remember a chopping block about this big, this square, one of those big maple ones, about this deep, with big sturdy legs, and the butcher's in there cutting meat. But the top of that was wavy from years and years of use. It wasn't flat like if you go to the grocery store, or if you go to a kitchen store now and buy a cutting board, they're all flat on top. This was a long ways from being flat anymore. In the alley there, or in what's now a parking lot between Marshall's and that grocery store, there was not only Paul Martin's garage, but there was also a hatchery of some kind, or they sold chicks and ducklings in there, and sawdust and feed, and you could buy chicken feed for your chickens. You could buy chickens, of course. And Dad bought his first car, real new car, from Paul Martin. And it turns out that Martin is the one that got the lot that my grandfather had lived in up there on North Spruce Street. And he's the one that built that cabin, or that house with the log exterior. I think there was some kind of a deal there. I'll give you a car if you give me the lot. Something like that. But the Brunenmeyers had another business, and they were involved. Someone mentioned Al Men's store. For a while, I think Chet and Ruth Brunenmeyer ran that for a while as well. They also converted the old Brunenmeyer grocery store, where the Essigs are now, into, I think it was a restaurant and a Spot Tavern, I believe. The brick building that was Reed's Garage, is that what you called it? That brick building was, I don't know who built it, but the Charles Zimmerman, the Zimmermans had businesses in there. They sold, what was the name of the car? They had a Buick dealership in there, but it was a dealership. You really just got permission to sell the car. You didn't really have a dealership like you do nowadays, I think. But there was another brand of automobile that none of us, well, some of us might remember or have heard of, but...
Studebaker?
Pardon?
Was it Studebaker?
I think they sold a Studebaker, too, but there was something else. Pardon?
Except the Edsel.
No, it wasn't the Edsel, before that. It wasn't a Pierce Arrow, but it was some name kind of like that. It was some Black Hawk or something like that, automobiles. They also sold silos. They sold a certain brand of silo made out of ceramic tile that was glazed. I don't think that there's a corn crib out there on the road to Matamora on the right-hand side on the old Esch property. You go around the S curves before you get just across 24. I don't think that's one that they might have sold, but that is a ceramic tile building. Really a beautiful corn. It's actually a corn crib, not really a silo. I don't think they sold that, but so they had several different businesses in there. Farm implements, Zimmerman's did. But some of the other things that I remember about the square, no one mentioned the fall festival yet, but there used to be a festival there in the fall, October, something like that. And there'd be Ferris wheels and all kinds of rides, and that was always fun because, again, there was the deal with go over to Johnny Leonard's and get an ice cream cone, which had the little paper slip down at the bottom of the cone on the inside, and every now and then you'd get a free ice cream. That was always fun. There was the Southside Tavern. I heard it called the Southside Restaurant, but for a while it was called the Southside Tavern. My dad used to meet up with other men, and that's, I think, where the genesis for the Kennel Lake Sportsman's Club originated there. But they also did fox hunting, which I didn't really approve of, and I still don't. But they'd go out, the men would gather there in the morning early. They'd go out to a particular piece of land, a 160-acre parcel, for example, and they'd surround it every 100 yards or so with men, would march towards the center and converge on whatever was in the middle. And if it was a fox, they would kill it. Well, that's just what they did then. But foxes were considered predators, and what else?
They had a bounty on them.
They probably did have a bounty on them. Yeah.
I went on a couple of those.
Yeah, I did one on them too. I didn't carry a gun. Another story about the Brennenmeyer store. My grandfather, Henry, used to hang out there a lot, and they sold cigarettes, I think it was, or tobacco. They had a little coupon with it. And it was like an S&H green stamp. If you got enough of these coupons, you could get something really neat for it. But my grandfather would hang out there, and a lot of the people would say, oh, I don't know. They just throw the coupon in the box. My father ended up getting an L.C. Smith shotgun. My grandfather did. Got an L.C. Smith shotgun with those coupons out of the catalog. So that was kind of an interesting story. What else can I tell you? Well, most of the rest of it involves contemporary things like where I went to school, and that's not really important. But Dad built a house on South Main Street in 1936, I think it was, when my brother was 2 years old. And I forget who the carpenter was, but Dad had a nickname for him. I think his name was John, but I don't remember the last name. It was One Nail Johnny or something like that. This guy would, during the day, would put up the framework for Dad, but he only used one nail at every joint. And so after work, Dad would come home and get his hammer and some nails to go out there and finish the job.
Dennis, they used to call it hit one nail.
What is it?
Remember that?
Hit one nail?
The hits.
Hit one nail. But
Almost had was a son, and his father was, remember right now, but they used to call him one nail hit.
one nail hit. That's it. That sounds right. And that house had cypress siding on it. It was rather expensive at the time, but it's also impervious to rot pretty much, and to insects and that sort of thing. And somebody put vinyl siding on it or something like that. And I know that the Peoria Awning and Siding Company or something like that has come through Washington and put a lot of vinyl siding on. But maybe I was really appalled when they did that to that house, because that house had real good, you had to paint it, of course, a lot of maintenance, but it was a beautiful house in terms of its construction. The upstairs was all knotty pine. Really neat house. Pretty small, though. I think that's about it, unless somebody's got something that they remember about my father. Dad was a pretty good golfer. He had 13 holes in one. And now, a lot of them were at Hillcrest, and that's, a par 3 course. But some of them were at Pine Lakes and other courses, too. And I can tell you right now, I bet you, well, never mind, I won't go there. I was going to say something about Tiger. Something about this golfer named Tiger Woods, but I don't think I will. Excuse me.
Where was your house on South Main again?
It was 914 South Main Street. If you go down past the creek and back up the hill and back out level, it's about the 4th house on the right, something like that. There was Roy and Emma Morris, Ted and Ted White. I can't remember his wife's name. Ted and Virginia White. Then Andy Anderson and his wife Ruth.
And Grigsby.
Grigsby's, yes. Where were they? Yeah, Grigsby's are up on the corner of what's now Oakland, I think, and also the Sizemores lived there too for a while. And then Johnny and Louise Spring lived on the next house after us, which brings up a point. I was wandering through the graveyard a couple of years ago, and I discovered Johnny and Louise's headstone. And to this day, I still plan to do something about this, but I noticed that Louise's headstone did not have the final date of her passing on it. And I thought, that doesn't seem right to me. I think I need to get that on there. So I went down to talk to blank. The city clerk, Pat Brown. And to get the proper date when she passed, I'm going to see if I can get that headstone engraved for her, because they were very, very nice neighbors. They're right on the other side of my favorite apricot tree. I've never had an apricot that was anywhere near as good. In fact, I don't even buy apricots anywhere because they can't begin to touch the flavor of those apricots. You had to move the little worms aside sometimes. They were wonderful apricots. And that tree's gone, unfortunately, but Dad had horses, ponies, and at the celebration of life yesterday, at the two different cousins had daughters that Dad gave ponies to. And one of them is a horsewoman now. I mean, she's a psychiatrist or a psychologist in Springfield. But that's her main hobby is horses. And she got her start with Dad. I had a pony. My brother had a pony. Dad loved horses, loved golf, he loved to fish, loved to hunt. He probably told more lies about hunting than all the rest of you in the room, but he was a good shot. He did hunting not just for himself, but if the other guy didn't get his bag, Dad would do it for him. He'd come back sometimes and say, well, we went to Wyoming, and how many deer did you get, Dad? 3. 3, the limit's only 1. He said, well, yeah, but so-and-so can't shoot. He couldn't hit the barn or hit inside of it. So he would sometimes help him out by shooting their deer, too. Unfortunately, I'm going back to California tomorrow. I would like to have stayed another day had I known this was happening, and I could have kept all those old pictures out. I shipped them out today, but a lot of interesting photographs of the old times. Anything else?
Well, let's thank Dennis also.